Today's passage feels like it could be a big-budget Hollywood film. Acts 27, the movie. Of course, then people would avoid watching it because, I haven't seen the other 26. Hi, I'm Justin Lee, and this is A Year of Bible. Boy, these final chapters of Acts are turning out to be pretty dramatic. In yesterday's chapter, Paul, imprisoned on false charges, was brought before King Agrippa, where he had a chance to talk to the king about Jesus. And at the end of the chapter, we see that the king was convinced Paul had done nothing wrong and could be set free, if only Paul hadn't already appealed his case to Caesar. But since he did, Paul must now be taken as a prisoner to Rome, and as we read today's passage, you might ask yourself, did Paul ever regret that decision? Let's see what happens as we read Acts chapter 27. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded an Adramyttian ship about to sail for ports along the coast of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration, allowing him to visit his friends and receive their care. After putting out from there, we sailed to the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. After sailing slowly for many days, we arrived off Cnidus. When the wind impeded us, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone. After we had moved along the coast with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lasea. By now, much time had passed, and the voyage had already become dangerous because it was after the fast. So Paul advised them, "Men, I can see that our voyage will be filled with disaster and great loss, not only to ship and cargo, but to our own lives as well." But contrary to Paul's advice, the centurion was persuaded by the pilot and by the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided to sail on, hoping that somehow they could reach Phoenix to winter there. Phoenix was a harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they thought they had their opportunity, so they weighed anchor and sailed along, hugging the coast of Crete. But it was not long before a cyclone called the Northeaster swept down across the island. Unable to head into the wind, the ship was caught up, so we gave way and let ourselves be driven along. Passing to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we barely managed to secure the lifeboat. After hoisting it up, the crew used ropes to undergird the ship, and fearing that they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and were driven along. We were tossed so violently that the next day the men began to jettison the cargo. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the great storm continued to batter us, we abandoned all hope of being saved. After the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have followed my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have averted this disaster and loss. But now, I urge you to keep up your courage, because you will not experience any loss of life, but only of the ship. For just last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And look, God has granted you the lives of all who sail with you. So take courage, men, for I believe God that it will happen just as he told me. However, we must run aground on some island.' On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea. About midnight, the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 20 fathoms deep. Going a little farther, they took another set of soundings that read 15 fathoms. Fearing that we would run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daybreak. Meanwhile, the sailors attempted to escape from the ship. Pretending to lower anchors from the bow, they let the lifeboat down into the sea. But Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men remain with the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes to the lifeboat and set it adrift. Right up to daybreak, Paul kept urging them all to eat. "Today is your 14th day in constant suspense without taking any food. So for your own preservation, I urge you to eat something, because not a single hair of your head will be lost." After he had said this, Paul took bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and took some food themselves. In all, there were 276 of us on board. After the men had eaten their fill, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they sighted a bay with a sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting away the anchors, they left them in the sea as they loosened the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was being broken up by the pounding of the waves. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners, so none of them could swim to freedom. But the centurion, wanting to spare Paul's life, thwarted their plan. He commanded those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to follow on planks and various parts of the ship. In this way, everyone was brought safely to land. Let me ask you a question. What do you think? Is this a happy story or a sad story? If this story were a Hollywood film, we'd probably say it has a happy ending, I think. In the movies, when people go through trials, losing everything along the way and barely making it through, but they still end up safe and sound, still alive, having gotten through the threat with their lives, that's usually considered a happy ending. They made it! Hooray! Everything else was dramatic tension. But in real life, is that how we feel? When we go through the storms of life, barely making it through, and along the way we lose everything except our lives, do we feel happy? Or do we feel defeated, overwhelmed by grief and loss? Real life isn't as simple as movies. In real life, I think this would be a story of tremendous pain and loss for a lot of these people, even though God brought them through safely. And for the last 2 days, we've been talking about times of trial and difficulty. I didn't originally set out to do a trilogy of videos about suffering, but as I read and prayed about these chapters, that's what kept coming up for me. 2 days ago, we talked about how God can use those difficult times to strengthen us and strengthen our faith, like how Paul was strengthened by the time he spent in prison without any comfort or freedom. Then yesterday, we talked about how God can use those difficult times, even the pain we haven't healed from, to open doors that might not otherwise have been open to us. Like how Paul was able to get an audience with rulers and important, influential people, all willing and eager to hear him talk about Jesus because of his suffering and imprisonment. But yesterday, when I talked about God opening doors, there's a saying that might have come to your mind that I intentionally did not use. The one about God closing a door but opening a window. And there's a reason I didn't use that, because I have to be honest with you, I've always hated that expression. I mean, first of all, I don't want to climb through a window. And second of all, it just feels so trite and cheesy. It's a thing people say to make you feel better when you've just suffered a major loss, but it doesn't usually make me feel any better. If I've been looking forward to going through that door, some big life event I've been eagerly anticipating, it doesn't make me feel better to have someone say, "Oh, don't worry, God has some other plan for you." Yeah, but I don't want some other plan. I want this plan. This was my plan. So today, having just read this story about people losing everything when their plans went awry, let's take our suffering theme one step further, if you will, and talk about loss. What have you lost in your life? What have you lost recently that's still weighing you down? There are different kinds of loss. Sometimes it's very straightforward. Something or someone you used to have and now you don't. A cherished possession, a job you loved, a relationship that ended, a person who passed away. Sometimes it's something more abstract. You've lost your support network, your financial security, your comfort, your sense of belonging. And sometimes, like with that closed door, what you've lost is the possibility of something that you were looking forward to. You'd been planning something, investing all your energy in building toward that future, telling yourself all this time it would be worth it when your plans finally came true. And then something happened, and the door closed. That future was lost. All your work to get there suddenly seemed wasted. And that's when people say, oh, when God closes a door, he opens a window, and you want to punch him in the mouth. Loss can be so painful. It can feel like you'll never recover from it. Maybe these last 2 days when I've talked about the ways God can use hardship in your life, maybe you've been tempted to think, not this. It's not worth it. Not when you consider what I've lost. That future, that life, that person. And maybe you've asked, why would God put me through this awful thing? Just to grow? Just to open another door? There has to be a better way for me to grow or for that door to be open. And maybe you're right. Just because God can use awful things to help us grow doesn't mean God wanted those awful things to happen. At least, I don't think so. Today's chapter is filled with loss. And it's always dangerous to play the what-if game, but it seems to me that the text suggests things could have turned out differently. Paul warned them in verse 10 not to undertake this voyage at this time, but they wouldn't listen. And in verse 21, Paul says, men, you should have followed my advice not to sail from Crete, then you would have averted the disaster and loss. That says to me that this disaster was not God's will. Now, this gets into tricky theological territory, and Christians disagree with each other on questions about predestination and the so-called problem of evil, and a lot of that is frankly out of my league. But my personal opinion is I don't think every bad thing that comes into our lives is orchestrated by God. I don't. I think if God gives us free will, then by definition, God has to allow things to occur in this world that are not God's will. Otherwise, how is our choice free? So my reading of this is that I do think the people in charge, the centurion, the pilot, the owner of the ship, could have chosen to listen to Paul and avoid this whole situation. I think God would have been pleased with that. But they didn't. And as a result, bad things happened. They ended up in stormy weather. They all suffered. The people who made the bad decision, and the people like Paul who didn't have a say in it at all. They all suffered together. And so much of this chapter documents their suffering and loss. They have many days and nights of fear, and I would imagine a lot of sickness. They went without food, they lost their cargo, they lost the ship's tackle, important equipment for the ship, they lost the lifeboat to keep the sailors from escaping, they lost their grain. In the end, they lost the whole ship. And for a long time, they were convinced they were going to lose their lives as well. As it is, they survived, but only barely, having lost every other thing they had. Maybe you've been suffering recently. Maybe you've lost something. And maybe it was due to your own bad decisions. Maybe you've spent many sleepless nights wishing desperately that you could go back and make different decisions. Or maybe it was out of your hands. Maybe it was all a result of other people's decisions or other factors that you had no control over. Either way, you're living now with this loss, where all you can think about is what life would have been like if things had gone differently. If so, trust me, I've been there. It hurts. And depending on what or who you lost, sometimes it hurts beyond words. And maybe you're even still in the midst of that storm, having already lost some things and not knowing what's next, or how you'll possibly make it through this storm that never seems to end. These are real things in this chapter that happened to real people who really didn't know if they'd survive. But they work pretty well as metaphors for our lives today too, don't they? Even just reading about how much effort they had to go through to secure the lifeboat, only to read a few verses later that they had to cut it loose anyway. But here's the lesson I think we have to take from this, or one of them at least. God will not abandon you. God is with you through the storm, but that doesn't mean you won't have loss. And it doesn't mean the loss won't hurt. And often one of the most difficult parts of picking yourself back up and moving forward is coming to terms with the reality that God still has a plan for you. And God is going to make sure you have everything you need for that plan. But that plan may not be the plan you had when you started. It may be missing pieces you thought were essential. It may wind up entirely different from what you thought you were setting out to do. And yet it's tempting to play what if. To say, if only they'd listened, or if only I'd listened, then we wouldn't have gone through that storm and lost so much. And yeah, maybe. Of course, maybe it was God's plan all along. Maybe the loss will teach you something or help you in some way. Maybe it really is as simple as God closing a door and opening a window, or hopefully a better door. On the other hand, maybe it wasn't what God would have liked. But it's what happened because we live in a fallen world and humans have free will. Even so, God can't be surprised, even if it wasn't God's desire for it to happen this way. God knew it would happen this way, and God was ready for it, long before you were even born. God knew Paul and the others would be caught in this storm, and God had a plan to see them through. Notice what Paul says here starting in verse 21. Men, you should have followed my advice not to sail from Crete, then you would have averted this disaster and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because you will not experience any loss of life, but only of the ship. And then he tells them about the message from God and ends with, so take courage, men, for I believe God that it will happen just as he told me. However, we must run aground on some island. Something about this is very powerful to me. Because it says that even in the midst of the storm, even when we realize that our own bad decisions or someone else's bad decisions caused bad things to happen, that doesn't mean it's all over, or that we're somehow beyond God's ability to bless us and use us and see us through to clear skies again. We can make choices that are outside of God's will, but we can never destroy God's plans because God knows what's going to happen and God will not abandon us. So what does Paul do? Not berate these guys, but urge them to have courage and trust that God will see them through. They will suffer loss, but God will protect them and there will be clear skies again. So when you're in the storms of life, you can't go back and undo what's been done, but you can take up your courage today in the midst of whatever you're going through and trust that God will see you through. But you may have to let go of some things along the way. Your old plans, your need to be in control, the things or even the people who have been your security blankets and made you feel safe in the past. Moving forward after times of great loss isn't always easy. Sometimes you just need time to grieve those losses. And you may always miss certain things or especially certain people. You may even be left with trauma that takes your whole life to heal, like we talked about yesterday. But no matter what you've lost, your story isn't done yet. So don't believe the lie that you can't go on without those plans, or that person, or that thing that felt like it made you who you were. You are still God's child with all the gifts God has given you. And no matter what you lose, God will bring you safely through the storm because God's still got plans for you. They may look totally different from what you thought they'd be, and it may take a while for you to see God's hand at work, but trust God, take courage, and keep moving forward one step at a time. Paul was well educated, powerful, important, and respected. Now at the end of this chapter, he's a prisoner with nothing, hated by his peers, shipwrecked on an island with no idea where he is. And God has only just begun to use him.